explaining the Biuri Hazeyar, which originates from the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe that I mentioned in Tovkuf Samachay, 1804. Explaining the verse in the book of Iyuv, of Job, V'hu mesibes mishapach b'tarbeles of lefalam, that he, God, mesibes mishapach, he turns the wheel. Mesaviv sivuvim is sometimes the expression. He turns, you hear the word, the wheel of circumstances, or the wheel of fortune, or the wheel of life. And this wheel is shaped by our actions. As we learned, the last thing we learned was that asursa dilatata, our actions, because from above does not come anything that's negative. He said also not good. What does that mean? Of course, all good comes from above. But he means the good that we experience in life is generated through our actions. And the same thing with the negative. Chesed or Gvura. So it is God that runs the world, but he bound himself. Like the Medrash brings, that after Hashem said, behold, I present to you the path of life. And the opposite. So from that time when Hashem said that, he bound himself and said that lo yotzer teva leiseha, that good will come, will be bestowed, will flow to the doer, to the person, based on his actions. So good will not go to someone that is doing evil, and evil will not flow to someone that's doing good. That was the first medrash. The second medrash, that it comes me'eleha, hara ba, le'isera, v'teva le'isera. That it comes, it's basically built into the system, cause and effect. And he brought from the Gemara in Kedushin, person does a mitzvah, so he is praised because he has tipped the scale toward the side of merit for himself. And then finally, the Emek HaMelech, I'm reading the top of page 1430, summing up what we learned, that Mipi Elyon, which means from the mouth above. What's Elyon? He says, it goes on Erech Hampen. Then afterwards, he says also on Zah, because from the Mipi Elyon, Erech Hampen or Zah, there's no, this Amshach is, there's only goodness. There's no ability to this shift, whether it comes from Chesed or Gvura that we're talking about, active Chesed and Gvura. Up there, it's only Kulei Teiv, like he said, primarily Chsadim and Zah, Elai de Maisa Tachtenim, our actions, the Maisa of Tachtenim below, that reach and impact the wheel, which is Malchus. And then he concludes, this is actually the words of the Alter Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek, of course, quite cites it as well. It's a very powerful way of summing up the Zayad. The inyan halos man shalamat ad heichenu magia. So where do our actions reach? How far, how high do they reach? And he says it reaches to the level of Malchus of Atzilus, the source of creations which interacts with us. V'lo yesed hagbal l'mayla, not higher than that. So yesterday we were discussing, and he's going to explain this some more, but discussing what this means exactly, because we do read and we do hear that our Aveda reaches a lot higher. We brought Amin Yehishmei Rabbah, the Chol Koiche, has the power to transform din, judgment, into Chesed, into Rachamim. We learned that at length earlier. Why? Because the Neshama has the power to access the highest levels of Atik, like we're speaking about here, Atik, Arich, all these levels that are higher. You can even transform them. Not only are you accessing it, but you're actually drawing it down and transformed. So that's already the power of the neshama to reach deeper levels, but not because we have an engagement there, it's because we simply root it. It's like, think of a father hiring a son in his business. So if he's a healthy father and a healthy businessman, he's going to create a structure. He's not going to just say, since you're my son, you can do whatever you like. comes into the business, gives him a particular function and job. People know it's a son, but a good father is going to say, you're subject to the same rules as everyone else is in this business. I'm not going to bypass. You can't go over people's head. You see, so often this mistake is made. You have to function within the rules of the organization, of the structure of the business. Now, he still remains a son. Let's say something happens. The son makes a mistake in the business. So the difference between the son and other workers, the son can come to his father and say, I need your compassion now. I'm talking to you as a child to a father. So then the father may bypass the rules as an exception, because it is, at the end of the day, it's his son. But that's not the rule of the structure of existence. The Torah mitzvahs tells us how to live our lives. If a person transgresses, there is the power of tshuva. And there is a power of, we talk, b'chol moedecha, like he said, b'chol koiche, b'chol kavanose, we learned the ability to reach the deepest levels of the core, and the ability to abolish and eliminate the gzar din, judgment, and furthermore transform it. We have that power. But that's not part of our relationship with God in existence. That's because we're basically accessing, so to speak, another track that's able to bypass the whole shishtalshlus and go to that place. And even there, it's not because of an impact. Because Asdi Hashem Leishanisi, we learned. That's simply because God, the neshama, is rooted there. And he explains, and we're going to learn this further, and we're going to learn it also. It's also explained in the Maimorim, but in the Biurei Hazayat. There's also a mimer from the very powerful mimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe, Tovshin Daled. I mentioned it, 1944, where he discusses this at length, and he asked the question: if our Avodah only reaches Malchus, why did we learn that Tkiyah Shefer has the power to reach to the highest levels, all the way to the Ratzon and Tainug of the Eibishter? So he explains, our Avodah triggers something in Malchus. Once Malchus is triggered, that opens up the channel of Malchus that allows higher energy to flow down. No one said that we can't get a flow that's coming from the highest levels. The question is where the engagement is. Like we said, what you can trigger. Our Avodah being Tachtenim on our terms can only trigger Malchus. It doesn't trigger higher levels. But once Malchus is aligned through our behavior, we access it and engages with us, then new doors open up that can be mamshich, that can draw down from the highest levels. But it's different. That's coming more what we call through, that is more indirect, not direct. Directly, our work touches Malchus, like he says, impacts Malchus. That's where there's the engagement of the divine with existence, which explains how it's integrated into our systems on our terms. Once you do that, he explains, then the flow from higher levels will go. Zoh will flow into Malchus. If Malchus is closed up because, let's say, because of our behavior, which is a negative behavior, which causes gvuras, obviously higher levels will not manifest. But once Malchus is so-called engaged, then think of it, I mentioned before about the Malachim are being like ministers, each one appointed to the different municipalities, the cities of the king's great empire. So each city does its thing. The people in one community, if they behave in a way that is destructive, so what they're going to receive in return is gvura, like we learned, judgment. And that will be passed on through the minister, through the malchus, and through the angels. Okay, if they do something of that's merits, they'll draw chesed. That's the system, the way God, the Melech, established. Now, once they do chesed, what happens? The ambassador or the agent of God, the ministering angels come to Hashem and say, well, they come. Hashem sees that you have done what he wants. So then the doors open and the king can send a special gift, can send special blessings because you've interacted, you followed the rules and reached Malchus. Now it can reach even higher levels where the king himself can even come visit that community. And Be'er Pnei Melachim, like we learned earlier, they could have the Hamshachas from higher levels as well. But that's Hamshacha that's coming from above. It's not a direct trigger of Midah Keneged Midah, that you do this and that triggers. That's in nature. In the world of nature, Mamala Kalamin, like he's been speaking, that is our interaction with Malchus. Higher than that requires our behavior to be right, and then come those higher levels. But then it's on God's terms, not on our terms. So we, in a way, we can open the door for it, but it's not quite like you have like when we talk about the Chesed talks about asusa dilatata, which means aveda from below. When we generate, in turn, when we generate through our effort, in turn it brings down an energy commensurate to our asusa dilatata. So if you put in a little work, you get something equal to that. But then it says that after you do that, then can be an asusa de la'ela that's higher than the asusa de la'ela that comes through your asusa de l'tata. Sometimes it's called like matnas chinam, like a gift. But regardless, it's more than your effort. It's like when someone does effort, they will benefit, they'll be rewarded for their effort. But let's say you're a teacher or a parent and you see the person, and they say, you know what, I want to give the person a bonus. I want to give them something additional. So even though it's your actions that ultimately led and generated the bonus, but the bonus was at the initiation of the giver, not of the person, not of the recipient. So the recipient did something that was rewarded commensurate, proportionately. And then new levels can be emerged, which is a very common theme of Chesed. Similar to what we count 49 days of the Omer, and the 50th day we don't count. That's already Hamshach. You set the stage. You clean up your act as much as you can, and then Hashem will bring something that you can't bring on your own that could only come from above. The 50th day called Matan Torah. So Matan Torah was initiated by God, but we made the keli for it. So essentially, the Aveda below makes the kelim that draws Chesed or Gvura, and once you have the kelim, then new higher levels can emerge. We're going to learn more about this. I just wanted to sum up a bit what we discussed, just a little more clarity in this topic. As far as the other question that was asked, which is we learned earlier that schar mitzvah b'hai al maleka, that there's no schar mitzvah in this world, except with certain exceptions. It's not a contradiction to what we're learning here, because the bottom line is our actions generate divine energy. The question is whether we'll see it or not. Chassidus gives the example that every mitzvah you do generates an energy, but it's munach b'kufsa. It could be like it's held in storage, it's held in escrow, so to speak, in Atzilus. Mashiach comes, you don't have to create the energy anymore. All you have to do is open up the chest, the treasure chest, the escrow account. The Rebbe brings it often when he says that we have already everything munach b'kufsa. Munach b'kufsa means it's already ready in the kufsa, is like a box, a chest. And all we have to do is open up. And the Rebbe says sometimes that we even have the key. And the door and the chest is even open, but now we have to reveal it in this world. So the point here is more that how our actions, where they reach, and they don't reach higher directly, but indirectly, as I said, they draw down. But how much it's revealed or not is already another discussion. Where you see wicked people prospering and good people suffering. How is that shtim? How is that reconciled with this? Because that's a short term, and we don't see the whole picture. And ultimately, everything will balance out, and then we'll see how our actions generated everything. Mashiach's coming is a direct result of our actions. The fact that Mashiach didn't come yet doesn't mean our actions didn't do work and we didn't accomplish anything. It's just we're not seeing the total result yet. We do see it, as the Rebbe points out, in the world, in the advancements in technology and in politics and in human rights and in the freedoms and so on. But the full picture will be seen when it's revealed. But it is coming, like he says in Tanya, chapter 37, beginning, Masenu b'avedesenu, that the whole Gilu of Yemesa Mashiach and Chis HaMesim is totally in our actions, because it's our actions that God gave the power to generate these energies. And as I said, there's different ways it generates, directly, the indirectly, and all the higher levels, which we will talk about more as we go on, as we learn on. So that's a summary a bit of what we learned. I'm ready to continue unless someone wants to ask something. Okay. So we'll start with a new paragraph on page 1430. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. By Inyan who, and the Inyan in this is, just want to see the beauty of Azer, Tzemach Tzedek. Just a second. Where he whether this next piece is from the Rebbe Rashab or is it before from the Tzemach Tzedek? 1 second. Okay. The Inyan who, page 1430. The Inyan of this is the Hina Yadua, is how it's known, V'nizbar Le'il. It was explained earlier, the Sefiros, on the bottom they add the word Atzilus, which is most likely correct. That the 10 spheres, even though you could argue that you don't need the word Atzilus here, because the 10 spheres in general, whatever level it is. But he has been talking about Atzilus, so most likely he's talking about the 10 spheres in Atzilus, not the 10 hidden spheres. So the 10 spheres of Atzilus, hey bebchinas memutza, ben Ein Sof ve'elam is biyah. They're in a state, a level of interface, memutza, or intermediary, but interface is the best word, between the infinite divine light, the ilm is biyah, and the worlds of biyah. So this is, of course, the central theme of Ayin Beis, interface. So that's what's known. I was also explained at length, actually, earlier, in volume 1, in volume 2, in volume 3. This is a very central theme throughout, that Atzilus, and specifically the 10 spheres, is a mamutza between the two. Ukamaimer. Antu, you are the one that dafikas. But he says dafikas means from you emerged the 10 spheres, lanhoge behun alman, to govern or to run with these spheres the world. In other words, as I explained a number of times, God could run the world any way he likes, but he wanted it to be in a logical structure. So he created instruments, extensions, attributes, which God himself is beyond these attributes. But he created these spheres, just like from them will evolve the Sar Maimoris, the 10 statements that God uses to create existence. So he does a lanhoge b'hon alma, to manage, to direct, to govern the world. That's the general role of the Sefiros. Uba Sefiros gufa, and in the 10 spheres themselves, ha'ikirhu, which is the primary force that serves as this intermediary, hubchinas midas, the zod atzilus, is the midas. When he says midas, not midois. Do you think midas is attributes or the emotions? Midas, the zod atzilus. I would say the emotions of zod atzilus. Maybe he means it with a vav, or he means midas. I don't think midas. It's midois. The zod atzilus. It's usually written with a vav, like the next word here. So in atzilus itself, we know there's chabad, moichin. So that's also part of the interface, but it's somewhat more removed. Malchus is more connected to biyah. So in atzilus itself, basically, you could almost divide into 3 categories. Since atzilus is an interface, the higher levels of atzilus is more speaking on behalf of Ein Sof. The lower level of atzilus, malchus, is speaking to biyah, and the midas of atzilus, like he says, zah, which is chagas nihi, the 6 emotions of chesed, gvura, tiferet, netzach, yesod, zohir, ampin. That is the primary, he says, ikirhu b'chinas midas. V'zeu shenikra midas. And that's why they're called midas. Midas means emotions, it means attributes, but it also means, as we remember, measures. The word midah means to measure, a measure. Lashon medida, from the word measurement, or the word defined. Shenimdadu v'nigbalu, because they're measured, and nigbalu, and they're and limited or defined, lefi eifena elimus. Because if you can have an interface, it has to speak the language of the one you're interfacing with. If the midas of Atzilus would be pure Ein Sof, then we're back to square one. The whole point of the interface, it's like a translator who speaks Hebrew and English. He needs to be able to speak Hebrew and then English to translate to someone who's English speaking. He only speaks Hebrew, it defeats the purpose. He's not an interface. So it's that measured and defined, commensurate to the worlds. That's what Zah is. But on the other hand, it's alakus. Like we learned before, it is Ein Sof compared to Biyah. But it's Ein Sof as it's packaged through Zah. Remember, Kutshe Brichu that turns the wheel, we said, was Ein Sof manifesting in Zah. So the liyes bebchinas moker. In order for it to be in the level of called a source. Because if it doesn't channel that energy in some measured way, you can't call it a source for existence. Since we're saying Atzilus, the 10 spheres of Atzilus, like an interface, so there's the divine part, the divine infinite part, and there's the way the midas serve as the measurements that channel the divine ultimately through Malchus into Biyah. We'll learn about that. Ein Sof Baruch Hu, because Ein Sof Baruch Hu on its own, the infinite divine light on its own, Ram umisnasa aden kates v'tachlis, is exalted and removed aden kates, without any limits, v'tachlis, so without limit and without end, me'erech b'chinas esses spheres d'Atzilus, from the 10 spheres of Atzilus. As much as those 10 spheres are divine attributes, but Ein Sof on its own, before it manifests in these attributes, is completely removed. He says the words literally. Ram misnasa aden ketz v'tachlis. Me'erech b'chinas esses spheres d'Atzilus. Erech means also, it's not even in proportion, it's not even in that domain. Not just that it's removed from the 10 spheres, me'erech means it's not even in that field. Shahari lav mikol iu midas klal. Inun midas klal. Like we say also on Pasuk Eliyahu, that same, the one he quoted before, because he on his own is without midas at all. Lav iu midas klal. He doesn't have any midas, any measure. So as soon as you say midas of Atzilus, measure compared to beyond measure is infinitely distant. The kosh came biyah. So Ein Sof is that distant from the 10 spheres of Atzilus, and how much more so from biyah, from Bri Yitzir Asiyah. So since we are talking now, for us to be able to understand, how could there be a relationship between two such entities that are such opposites? Ein Sof, beyond any structure and definition, and Biyah, which is completely about structure and existence, like we've talked many times, the creator, the creation, the immortal, the mortal, the infinite, and the finite. So, b'chdei liyas hanhogas ha'elamis, lisnaga bahun alma. So, in order, and this is in a logical way, that there should be the governing, hanhogas ha'elamis, the behavior, and of hanhogas ha'elamis of the worlds, sorech liyas al-yedei hamidus. That's why it needs to be through the midas, because Ein Sof is too far beyond our existence. You need something that's interfacing. It's still all part of the divine and still the divine instruments, that's clear, and divine attributes. But it's now come from the state of Ein Sof into a state of Medida. We have Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Chayid Yesod. Like we learned earlier, At the end of the day, these are defined attributes. Yes, they're saturated with the divine. They feel only godliness, but they're actual attributes. Like we learned on page 1428, where he said that these are basically the God's powers to express himself in Chesed, in Gilui, or Helam, or combination thereof. And that's why I call it Ispilus. There's a Ispilus there. There is an engagement. However, it's not engagement with creation, it's engagement with these attributes. So it is a descent. It's gone down a level from the infinite, unshaped divine, has now gone into a shape, the divine manifesting in a shape and form of these measured attributes, these measurements, which in turn, that's how there could be anhogas elements. Or else it would have to be a miracle. It would have to be kol yachol. How can an infinite God run a finite world and every detail of existence, every hashgacha pratis, every detail is accurate and by design? So now we have the place where this happens, like we discussed at length, the purpose of the 10 spheres, and the big question being, how divine are they and how much do they relate to existence? As we've discussed earlier when we spoke about where there's no hispilus, where there's hispilus in the midas, then there's finally in biyah, what we're learning now, like in Malchus, was actually a shinui, an engagement. But in the level of Atzilus, we learned it's not an engagement with existence, it's an engagement with the attributes. Okay. And that's how he governs the world. Al yidei hamidus. The b'chinas chesed, and he spells it out, what this means. The level of chesed, of the midas, kindness, hu ashpa lahachyes. That's the divine transmission to give life. Chesed is essentially the channel through which God channels the hashpah, the transmission of life. Lahachis. Machalkel chaim bechesed. Machalkel chaim, he sustains and feeds life bechesed, with chesed. So chesed is that channel, the divine channel toward giving life. V'nikra be'idra rabba. Daf kuflam gimel beis. And idra rabba, which is Zohar Pasha Nosei, called Idra Rabba, the larger group or the larger gathering, 133b, he calls it Chesed Elam. He calls it Chesed Elam, the Chesed of the world. Why? V'hainu, and this means Shubchinis Chesed Hamoker Lias Nimshach B'menu B'chinis Elam, Chaya Gufa. Why is it called Chaya Elam? Chesed Elam rather, because it's the Chesed, which is the source from which will be nimshach, well, from where it will draw. From it, b'chinas elam chaya gufa, the level of the world, existence, chaya gufa, the life of the body. So where is it getting its energy from? Where is it getting its sustenance from? Chesed. B'chalkel chaim b'chesed, chesed elam. That's why it's called chesed elam, not just chesed to mean God's kindness, but this is a kindness that's directly focused on from where the flow comes from there toward giving energy. So just like you see, electricity has a source, life, the life force within existence has a source, and the source is Chesed of Atzilus. Mashenke Chesed the Atik, by contrast, Chesed of Atik, not Atzil, higher than Atzilus, Shenikra Chaya Nishmosa. That's called the life of the soul. She'ena moker klal. That's not at all a source. Sheyumshach b'menu, from which will be extended, from which will be drawn. Chaya gufa, physical life, the life of the body. B'chinas biyah. Kim chaya nishmosa. So Atik also is has chesed. But chesed of Atik is removed from existence as we know it, because existence as we know it is biyah, is the defined nature. Gufa doesn't only mean a physical body. It means a body of existence, the body of the structure of existence. So that's the difference in Chesed of Atik and Chesed of Atzilus. So as a mamutza, Chesed of Atzilus serves the role because on one hand it's giving life, that's divine life. On the other hand, is directed toward life into biyah, not just spiritual life, so to speak, not just ethereal life, but ethereal energy, but one that will sustain biyah, both the spiritual levels of biyah and the physical levels. But it means here a defined world called bria, creation. let me stop here if anybody wants to ask anything. He's obviously still in the middle of it, but anything needs clarity here, clarification.
Yeah, so the level of Atik, Chesed of Atik, is Chayad Nishmasa. What is that? It's not the actual neshama of a person. It's a more of a amorphous kind of source of it.
Even if it's a neshama of a person, but it's not as it manifests inside the person. The neshama above. For it to be able to come into the body and into the lower worlds and biyah. If a neshama remains in Atik or in Atzilus, it's not a neshama that comes into a body below. You need a neshama to go through these levels. So, as I said, Chai Guf, it doesn't necessarily mean only the body, and that's the soul. It just means the body means biyah, the whole created existence as we know it. Atzilus, at the end of the day, is a divine world. Atik is for sure divine. The Atik is even higher. He's basically saying Chesed of Atzilus is a Chesed that's already going to channel life into the creation, the created worlds of Bria, Yetzir, Asiya, and ultimately allow for life of a soul to enter a body. And whereas Chesed of Atik is exclusively focused on things that are spiritual and beyond the Biyah, higher than Biyah. And of course, therefore, also higher than any physical body. I don't think he means neshama and guf as we know it. I think he means in the broader terms of more spiritual and one that relates more to the matter, I guess, matter. But biyah is a general term because remember, bria, yitzir, asiya also have a spiritual side to them. But it's a spiritual that's already entered the world we call bria, creation. The spiritual of Atzilus and higher than Atzilus, we don't call it bria. We call it more of an emanation, more an extension or expression of Elokus.
But Atzilus is Atzilus and Mamale and Atik would be Soveh. So, do we have an individual down here in Olam Hazeh Gashmi can affect and has a connection with the level of Soveh of his neshama of Chesed of that particular person?
First of all, he doesn't call it Soveh, so I don't want to use that word. Second of all, that's not the discussion whether we have a connection. We said the soul reaches the Atzmus. We have the soul is rooted in the Helam Atzmi, but it's higher than Atik. It's higher Lifnei Atzimtzum. That's not the question here. The question is how do we have an interface to create existence? The discussion here is the possibility that since the Devair Ein Sof is beyond any structure, and including Chesed Atik is beyond existence, so what's the way that where's the interface? And the answer is it's Chesed Eilam, what he calls Chesed of Atzilus. That's what he's addressing here. But the neshama we learned earlier is rooted in very high levels. That's not at all what he's discussing here. Here it's about addressing how the divine creates and interacts, manages, it governs existence. And that's going to affect the soul too, because the soul, remember, comes from those higher levels, is going to descend into this world, and it goes through. We say every day, Neshama shenesata bi tahirihi, usually refers to Atzilus, Ata barasa, Ata yitzarta, Ata nefachta bi, Ata meshamra b'kirbi. So you have there Atzilus, Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya.
So this is even Neshama in the way that it's Melubash Baguf. Comes from Chesed.
I explained Chayin Nishmasa compared to Chayin Gufa because Atik is not involved in giving life to existence, to Biyah, which in general terms is referring to Gufa here, and also more specifically, not to the soul as it enters the body. That Atik is focused much more on the Neshama alone, Chayin Nishmasa, not Chayin Gufa, Chayin Elam, but Chesed Elam. So if in specific terms, Atik would be connected more to the soul, and Chesed of Atzilus would be connected more to the body. But I'm just saying, I think it means here more broader than just soul and body. It means the general levels of soul and the general levels of body as the difference between Atzilus or Atik and Biyah. And the key thing is to remember that we're looking for the mamutza. That's Chesed Elam or Chesed of Atzilus. Okay? Any other questions? Like it says elsewhere. Okay. So we know there are two sets. There were twice in Torah where you find the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. One is in Pasha Kisisa, where Hashem reveals the 13 attributes of compassion, Havaya, Havaya, Kel, Grachim, V'chanun, etc. And there's the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim in Micha, which actually we say when we say Tashlich, and other times there's references made to it. So they're both 13 attributes, but the language is different in them. So he's going to say, so Chassidus explains, L'kutei Torah, the Alter Rebbe explains what's the difference between the two sets, the two forms of Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. So he says like this, Micha, the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim in Micha, the prophet Micha, the book of Micha, where he brings these 13 attributes, Hein Ba'atik. They're in the level of Atik. The Hein L'chaya HaNeshamis. And that's focused on Chaya Neshamis, drawing down the compassion for the life of the souls. That's the expression. Shu Chaya L'kus. Divine life. Now that's needs Rachamim too. But the Yud Gimel Mitzvah Rachamim of Moshe, as we're going to see in a moment, is also bringing it down because he was drawing it down to the Eden down below who built the golden calf. So that's he's going to call Chaya Gufim. Chaya, he says afterwards, after the parentheses, let's say the Chaya HaGufim. Well, let's read the parentheses. Benira. This is the Rebbe Rashab's edition. And it appears, it seems, She'ein HaHefresh B'zeh Ben Atzilus L'Biyah, that this that's coming from Atik doesn't distinguish between Atzilus and Biyah. Why? Because once you have these Yud Gimel Mitzvah Rachim of Micha, V'chaya Neshamas Chaya L'kus, then Nimshachim Gam Ken B'Biyah. Because these Yud Gimel Mitzvah Rachim are also going into Biyah. In other words, he's qualifying. You could think that the Chesed of Atik is only for Atzilus and not for Biyah. He says Nira, and that's not the case. It's also for Biyah. But for what level in Biyah? It's for the divine life, for spiritual life. So it's Yud Gimel Machim, let's think of it like Yud Gimel Sarachim for the Nefesh L'Kis, for the divine soul. It doesn't say that explicitly, I'm just explaining it. That's Micha. How about the Yud Gimel Midas Sarachim of Moshe? Well, Moshe, Himshich, Yud Gimel Midas Sarachim, and Moshe drew down the 13 attributes of divine compassion, B'Zoh. In Zoh, that's Zoh and Atzilus, not Atik. Let's say the Chaya Gufim, for the purpose, for the need of life of the bodies. It means physical life, material life, corporeal life. Like he writes in Idr Rabbah 138a. Remember, Idra Zuta, Idr Rabbah again is Pasha Nosei Zayat. He gives us the page. Alter Rebbe explains it in L'kutei Torah. And why is this the case? So he says, V'hainu, and this means, Mishum, the Chesed Atzilus, Hushen is Samsum L'fiyarach Elimus. Because Chesed of Atzilus is divine Chesed, but it's now already been diminished and been channeled, commensurate and proportionate to the worlds. And that's the difference between these two levels. So Chesed of Atik is Chesed, but it's a Chesed that's reserved for higher states. But you want to say, do you also have Yud Gimel Midas Rachim in our material lives? Like someone can say, I need God's compassion. And they tell you, yeah, you'll have God's compassion when you daven and you learn and you do mitzvahs. No, I want God's compassion also in my health, also in my business, also in Parnasa, also with Shalom Bayis, also with things in this material world. So that's the difference. Yud Gimel Midas Rachim and Micha is on spiritual matters. And the Bigdil Mitzvah of Moshe is physical. Chaya Gufim. And that's where it becomes the Mamutza, because it's commensurate to the worlds of Biyah. So he made it clear here in the parentheses that also from Atik, you have Hashpah and Biyah. But it's Hashpah, again, a spiritual Hashpah and Biyah, not on the spiritual matters that we are engaged with in Biyah. Whereas the Gemisa Machim and Moshe relates to the worlds themselves. Okay. Any other? Okay, any questions?
Rabbi Jacobson, when we were talking about Moshe Rabbeinu and the Midot of Rachamim, we discussed explicitly of the Rabbi Rashab did that Hashem put him in between two rocks, which was the Helem, the Etzem. But now we're talking about the Zah. How do you reconcile the two?
Because that's the power of tshuva. The power of tshuva has to come from a very, very deep concealed place, because they built a golden calf. But there's another thing called Yud Gimel Midas Arachmim that originates from there and then travels all the way through Atzilus and Zav Atzilus. The root of the Yud Gimel Midas Arachmim is higher than Zav Atzilus. It's just that they're going through Zav Atzilus. That's how I would reconcile that. I have to go back and see the exact language back there, but I'm almost sure he said something like that there. So there are many hamshachas that come from very high levels, but then as they travel downward, the question is how much do they manifest in relating to existence? If I recall, that's what he said, that the Helam Ha'atzmi, it's rooted in the Tzur. You're talking about the Tzur. And then it travels then. I think he even said it explicitly, but I have to look it up. If you want to look it up later, you can. But it's a good question. But that's how I would answer it.
I would like to ask how...
Remember, you have to remember just one more thing. Atzilus itself is also rooted higher than Atzilus. Everything is rooted in higher levels. Nothing starts in Atzilus. So the mere fact that say Atzilus means that God emanated, Vayetzal min haruach, he imparted from the spirit of a higher level into, that's Atzilus. And the 10 spheres of Atzilus we know are rooted in the 10 hidden spheres. So you're going back all the way to the highest levels. The question is the role of Atzilus. Atzilus is bringing it down to a point where it can now become a platform that can serve as an interface. If you only go back to the deepest source above, you don't have the interface element. And that's what Moshe added. So it's actually a very, very high level. To be able to come down that much, in some ways, the Yud Gimel Midas Arachmim of Moshe, even though it says Micha is Atik, but being able to bring it down also has a particular power that comes from a very deep place. I'm almost sure he said that earlier, but I have to look it up. I don't want to now start searching, but I have to go back to where he discussed this at length. Somebody wants to look it through, maybe you'll find some interesting points regarding that. Yeah, go ahead. You wanted to ask something? Eliezer, you're saying something?
Yes, that it said earlier, the Rebbe just said, so my question is, we're now speaking about Moshe Rabbeinu bringing down Yud Gimel Midas Arachmim. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu, I think, is the level of Chachma of Atzilus, which is Seichel, not Midos. Are we saying, is the Rebbe saying that even though the Chabad of Atzilus, the only way it can come down to this world, it has to go through Midas? Is that what he means? That the world is controlled through Midas, only through Midas? Why doesn't he say the Hanhag of the Olamos is through Seichel and Midas of Atzilus? Where's the Seichel part? The Chachma Bina Das. What's happened to that? We don't have that in a pure form. It has to transform only Chachma of Chesed, Chachma of Gevura, only through the Midos.
Well, first of all, regarding Moshe being Chachma, I think I've discussed this in the past. There's many levels. Moshe is Chachma. Some places he's Bina, some places he's Das, some places he's Zah, and some places he's Malchus. So just be aware, it says all that. As a matter of fact, there's a letter from the Rebbe explaining all the different levels that Moshe Rabbeinu is. So, since he doesn't bring Moshe's Chachma here, it's not relevant to this because not necessarily he's discussing that level. If you look closely at the language, he said that Yodua and his Bar Le'il, that the Sefiros of Atzilus are the interface. He said it clearly. That's the first words. Then he says, well, by Sefiros Gufa, in the 10 spheres itself, this is classic way of how Chassidus explains things. In general, all the 10 spheres serve as the mamutza. Chabad, but when you really get down to in Atzilus itself, as I explained, Chabad associates more to the source. Malchus associates more to the recipient. And the Midas is where the main thing. Look at, for example, when a person has a relationship with someone. So, of course, you have your mind that dictates and guides you in your love to your spouse or to your family. But where does the relationship play itself out? It's in the world of emotions. So this is a very common theme in Chassidus, that Midas require another. So Moichin is really more for yourself. So even though Moichin is part, that's why it says that 10 spheres in general are part of the interface. But the Ikar, where it plays itself out, is Midas from the word Medida, because Midas actually create a defined structure. And that's the primary. But it doesn't negate that the rest of the spheres are all part of the Mamutza. Second thing I want to say is that the bringing of Micha and Moshe is Ukamoshe Kosev. He's coming to explain somewhat the difference between, he's trying to explain the difference between Chesed of Olam of Atzilus and Chesed of Atik, Chaya Nishmasa. That's the main thing why he's bringing that. Okay. So we'll stop here at the period. Lefi Erech HaElemis. We're going to continue this discussion. But the point that he's established is that the Sefiros of Atzilus, and namely the Midas, are the main the channels that interface between the divine and existence. Now, we still have to get back to Malchus and more the other parts of these dynamics, but that's where he's going with this. And he's pretty going to be pretty elaborate about this whole subject. He's not mincing. Yeah, it goes a few good pages here.
I didn't look ahead, but I've been assuming in this class today that when he says that these midos of Atzilus are the essentially the mamutza, the interface with Biyah, that he's saying they're the source of the Elokus, of these different aspects of God, of the Eberster, that flow down to Biyah, derech, through Malchus, because he said that Malchus is the channel, is where it happens, or no? Is that a false assumption?
No, it's not a false assumption. Most likely, that's exactly where he's going to go.
Okay.
Remember,
and I have one other question. Sorry.
Remember, the Va'inyan who is coming to explain, he finished saying that the shinui, the change and the impact is in Malchus, the wheel. But remember, he said Kutchabrichu, who turns the wheel, he said was Eirein Sof Melubish Bezah. So he's going to explain this now in more elaborate detail.
The other question I had, which occurred to me, the background is, there's no discussion of the Kav here. Now, maybe this is sort of the more intricate, how the Kav manifests itself. But when we talked about, number one, Malchus being the sort of the place where there's a Shinui, there's actual, Hamshacha, Mamish from Malchus of Atzilus into Biyah, on the one hand, number one. Number two, even preceding that, was the function of the angels, essentially being like shluchim, emissaries, and they're delivering, a sort of parcels of Elokus, if you will, good and bad. But there was no mention of the Kav, which I thought essentially was fundamentally that portion of the construct of God's metaphysics that actually delivers godly energy into Biyah. So I'm a little confused about the function of the Malachim and Malchus on the one hand versus the function of the Kav.
Can you use your imagination and find an answer for that? You want me to answer?
Well, I'm guessing you're going to say it's both. I'm guessing you're going to say that the Malachim and Malchus are sort of apparatuses or apparati for the Latin plural that enable the Kav to work. I'm guessing, but that's the best I can do.
Well, to go further than that, keep in mind, you can ask the question even further. We learned earlier that the root of all of this is even higher than the Kav. The Kav also has a root. It's called Koyach HaGvul Shebe'ein Sof, or the Eir HaGvul in Eir Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, Shir Atzmei B'Koyach, when God envisioned. So let's go back to a practical example. As I always say, I always like to stay away from the mechanics and make it mathematical. When you say an artist is going to create art, how many stages does it take from the innermost part of his soul before he's even thought of being an artist, and definitely before creating art, till the art actually is created? You could probably spell out maybe hundreds of levels, but let's just spell out a few of them. First, it has to arise in his soul, in his spirit, in his will, a conscious desire to be an artist. Then has to come a conscious desire to create a specific type of art. Then there has to be a conscious plan of what type of art. All this is still within him and nothing has happened yet. Then comes his preparing the resources for it. Then he has to get a canvas and an easel and a stylus, a brush, get all this stuff ready. Then he begins. But then he has to also create a tzimtzum to conceal all the other options and all his brilliance, so he can focus exclusively on this creation of art. That's tzimtzum. Then comes a kav, where there's like a laser beam. He's using the brush to begin to paint his masterpiece. We don't yet have Ak, Akudim, Nekudim, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir Asir. Nothing's been painted yet, but it's all part of the process. This kav is carrying the divine energy and the divine plan, but it's so intense still that there are no kelim yet. So then begins Ak, a general blueprint and big picture of the whole thing. And then from there comes Akudim, 10 energies in one container. Then come 10 energies in 10 containers, but they're so intense that there's an incongruity, there's a dissonance. And then finally Atzilus, now you have Eris and Kelim measured, and is actually painting the structure of Chesed and Gvura and Sefiros and so on. And all the spheres for that matter, all the 10 spheres. So you're asking the question purely from an abstract point of view. But if you think about it, the Kav, without the Kav, there'd be no Atzilus. But without Atzilus, you wouldn't have an art. You wouldn't have art. Atzilus now serves the role of being an actual painting of God's picture, the world as he wants it to look like, which is the 10 spheres of Atzilus. Chesed is perfect. Gvura is perfect. They're all aligned and divine expressions, but there's a structure now. And that will in turn allow for the structure, the next level of Tzimtzum and Parsa, to create a world of Biyah where there's now independence that moves, it's not purely divine, becomes the ego-conscious existence of Bri, Yitzir, Asiya, all the way to our world. And then we see the world that this world that we see can be traced back to Bria, all the way back to Atzilus, which can be traced back to the Kav, which can be traced back all the way before the Tzimtzum. That's how I would frame it.
Thank you. Very helpful.
And I especially elaborated because I think it's important to understand Chassidus in general in this context. It's not just levels. Everything is part of a very eloquent and, what's the word I want to speak, a very organized structure of how things evolve from one level to the next, to the next, to the next.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to stop here by the word